My friend needed help. I didn't realize how badly. When my friend Jess rang me to say she'd had a fight with her flatmate, I was only too happy to help her. She needed a place to stay while tempers cooled on both sides, and not having seen her for far too long, I thought it would be a great chance for us to reconnect. Jess was a few years younger than I. As kids, she'd been the only girl on a street full of boys, and no one had wanted to play with her. I might have treated her no different if it hadn't been for how I'd found her sitting by the road one day, crying. She'd skinned her knee falling off her bicycle and was in such need of comfort that she didn't care who I was, but simply reached out her arms to me as soon as I drew close. It seemed so natural to me then to pick her up and carry her home. She was light as a feather in my arms, and as she buried her face in my chest and slowly let her sobs dry out, I remember I felt as if I was doing something important, something good. After that, she became much like a sister to me. It was only our differing paths through life that had prevented us from keeping in touch. I knew she was a librarian now, and that she had a small place in the city, to which the town I lived in functioned as a sort of suburb. Then there was her flatmate, of course, but that was mostly the extent of my knowledge. I very much looked forward to remedying that. Again, thank you so much for this. She was standing in my hallway, putting away an umbrella with a small duffel bag set down by her feet. An apologetic smile was inching across her face. Not at all, I said. Anytime. It was very good to see her again. She looked much like I remembered her, short and slender, draped in a knitted sweater to sizes too large, just how she always liked it. Seeing her up close, I did think she looked a little thin, even by her own standards, somewhat hollow in the cheeks. There were dark patches beneath her eyes, and her skin had a waxy sheen to it. Whatever had been going on must have taken a toll on her. I thought. I resolved that while she was here, I'd make sure she had all the rest and relaxation she might need. There was now a brief and slightly awkward pause, where neither of us quite knew what to do. Cup of tea? I suggested. Her smile widened, reached her eyes. That, she said, sounds like just the ticket. In the kitchen, I set 2 steaming mugs on the table. Ceylon for me, chamomile for her. So, I said, like to talk about it. She looked down, considering her answer. Then she shrugged. It's going to sound rather silly. Promise you won't laugh? I'll try. Well, she said, apparently I've been walking around in my sleep. Then, it all came out, as she told it. It had begun a few weeks ago. Her flatmate Mila had gotten out of bed one night to use the toilet. Walking past the kitchen, she'd found Jess standing there with her back to her, clad only in a nightgown. She seemed to be staring silently at the wall, first amused, then concerned when her questions went unanswered. Mila had reached out to touch Jess on the shoulder, whereupon Jess had turned and screamed madly in Mila's face. She then collapsed upon the floor in a sobbing heap. And you know, I can't recall any of it. Jess was shaking her head. I just found myself in the kitchen with Mila standing over me. My face was wet, so I knew I'd been crying, but even that must have happened before I really woke up, and I felt so terrible, exhausted and aching all over. What happened then? I asked. Well, Mila was rather shocked, of course, but she helped me back to bed, and that was that. She took a big sip of her tea. Until the next time. Because it had just kept happening. For whatever reason, Jess could not refrain from wandering the flat at night. No longer content with placing herself silently in a corner, she'd begun performing odd pantomimes of her daytime routine. Seated in the sofa, she would stare at the TV without turning it on, or hold a book upside down while turning the same page back and forth. Other times she would wander around, picking up this or that object to carefully study it, always as if seeing it for the first time. Mila found the situation increasingly hard to live with. In addition to worrying about Jess's well-being, it was difficult to sleep with someone puttering around the flat all night. She began to get irritable during the day, and so did Jess, who found the sleepwalking did not remotely refresh her as a night in bed might have. There was no dealing with it. You absolutely could not wake her, or the result would be an immediate and hysterical meltdown. Sometimes to the point of self-harm. Tore out a good clump of my hair, Jess said, or flailing around so violently she'd once backhanded Mila across the face before calming down. Jess tried to shut herself in her bedroom at night, but her sleeping self apparently retained the knowledge of where the key was hidden. She would simply let herself out to perform her nightly chores, then conscientiously lock herself back in when she was done. The situation finally came to a head when Mila had woken to find Jess standing at the foot of her bed. Mila's door too had been locked, but the same type of key functioned on all the interior doors of the flat. So that didn't stop me. Now I was watching her sleep apparently. It frightened her quite a bit. Didn't know what to do. You see, being worried at how I'd react if she made any sign of acknowledging my presence. She lay there for a good while, watching me watching her, until finally I spoke. I set down my mug of tea. You spoke to her while you were sleeping? Jess made a rueful face. Oh yes. Again, I remember not the slightest bit of this, but she told me. I looked her straight in the eye, smiled, and said very clearly, "Bitch, now isn't that just lovely?" That was that. Mila no longer felt safe in her own home. Jess had half-heartedly brought up a number of workarounds, the possibility of Mila barricading her door from the inside, or Jess's door from the outside, or even herself consenting to be restrained somehow. But she knew even as she said it that these were not serious suggestions. Neither one had signed up to play at prison when they became flatmates, and it was no way for people to live in any case. No, she had to go, and stay gone, until some permanent solution was discovered. I looked at her across the table. Wow, I said, quite. But Jess, I mean, this is a little heavier than what you gave out on the phone. Yes, she said, sounding resigned, and I'm sorry really. I didn't know how to explain it all without making it sound insane. Though it would help if we could sit down first and talk in person. I'm sorry. If you want me to go, she made as if to get up. No, I interrupted. No, of course you can stay. I was just surprised, that's all. It's a lot to take in. I know. Can I ask you though, have you thought about maybe seeing someone, a doctor? It does sound like. Yes, she said. I know. I will. I just need a few days to settle myself, sort of. I know it's very serious and I really am going to take care of it. I just need a little time. Is that all right? She looked at me with such pleading eyes, and I realized I would sooner cut off my hand than tell her no. In fact, I wanted nothing more than to scoop her up in a great big hug and cradle her as I had all those years ago. As it was, I settled for assuring her that yes, it was all right. Everything would be all right. I set her up in the spare bedroom. I'd had a flatmate myself for a time, but that was long ago and it had been vacant ever since. It suited her. The room. The previous tenant had left a pair of curtains with little cartoon animals on them. No doubt it had been intended as ironical, but they made Jess giggle with genuine delight. It was good to see. Before I headed off to my own room, we sketched out a brief plan of attack. I don't think it will be too much of a problem, Jess said. You may want to lock your door, of course. If you should happen to see me wandering around, just try to ignore me as far as possible. But if I do throw a fit, please don't hesitate to restrain me. If I hurt you in any way, I really don't think I could bear it. Not to worry, I said. You may have noticed, Jess, but you are half my size. I think I can handle things. I know you can. It's always made me feel so safe. She smiled shyly, then added, big brother. I think it was the first time she'd called me that since we'd grown up. I liked hearing her say it. Back in my own room, I did not immediately prepare myself for bed. Instead, I grabbed a book from the bedside table, seating myself in an armchair. I began to pass the time with some reading. This was a Friday night, so I could catch up on my sleep the next morning. A perfect opportunity then, to observe Jess in action. I knew this was no sort of game, of course, but I couldn't help being dreadfully curious. Moreover, I told myself it would benefit everyone if I could get a handle on how serious the situation truly was. The book was only a cheap mystery novel, but it quite gripped my attention, so much so that when I suddenly heard footsteps going down the hall, I almost jumped in my chair. Glancing at my watch, I saw that several hours had passed already. It was now nearly 1:45. I rose, listening. The steps went into the kitchen. Then there was silence for a moment, followed by the sound of running water. A chair scraped against the floor. Moving as quietly as I could, I unlocked my door and crept out into the hall, on tiptoes, no doubt looking perfectly absurd. I slowly made my way to the kitchen. I was becoming aware of a low hissing noise now, growing in intensity, and I felt an electrifying sense of fear and mingled excitement that made my skin tingle. The door to the kitchen stood open. Carefully, I pressed myself up against the wall beside it and peeked around to see Jess, seated at the table with a magazine in front of her. On the counter, the electric kettle was merrily coming to a boil. The noise was obviously recognizable now. In retrospect, she looked up and smiled pleasantly. Hello, I grinned sheepishly, and stepped around the doorway. Hi, sorry for creeping up on you. I thought, I didn't wake you, did I? No, I said, and seated myself opposite her. Couldn't sleep. Ah well. She went back to the magazine. I sat there for a while, uncertain. I had expected to find her sleepwalking, not getting another late-night cup of tea before bed. I suppose she was putting off sleep for as long as possible, which made a certain sense. Unfortunately, now I didn't quite know what to say. I studied her. She was obviously dressed for bed, wearing a long t-shirt that reached almost to her knees. Her bare legs were pale and skinny, and I wondered that she wasn't cold. She had at least put on a pair of fuzzy green socks, which was good, as I knew how freezing the floors could get. I made a note to set the heating a few degrees higher during the night. It wouldn't do for her to catch cold. She still seemed occupied with her reading, but as I was looking at her, she leaned back in her chair and slowly began spreading her legs. The nightshirt rode up her thighs, and I saw just enough to realize she wasn't wearing any underwear before I jerked my head away, face burning. I turned back to find Jess grinning unpleasantly at me. The expression was one I couldn't recall having seen on her before. "Caught you looking," she said. "Christ, Jess, don't do that." She smirked, crossing her legs and leaning back over the table again. Wasn't expecting company, was I? I felt both flustered and embarrassed. She must have done it on purpose, I thought. Some sort of rude joke? It was very unlike her. But then, she had obviously been under a lot of strain lately. Being honest, I had also sort of intruded on her. Part of me wanted to get up then and there to hide myself in my room. But I thought that would only make things more awkward in the end. We were going to be living together for several days after all. Instead, I made an attempt at changing the subject, so I began. "This thing," she leered at me. "The sleepwalking," I said hastily. "It just happened one day." Happened? I mean, there were no signs or anything leading up to it? Something that could have, I don't know, caused it? "Well," she said, a conspiratorial note creeping into her voice. "There was this book." "A book? You know, people donate all sorts to libraries. Worn out old paperbacks mostly, usually in dreadful condition. We throw out so much. Then there's the duplicates, of course, the hundreds of copies of this year's bestseller and so on. But, every so often, something quite decent turns up in the pile. I was working late one evening when I came across it. It immediately caught my eye. This was a proper book, you see, old, but in such fine condition, and bound in lovely black leather like a Bible." "Was it a Bible?" she snorted. "Hardly. The title read House of Shadows, written in Aramaic. I speak a little Aramaic, did you know?" I had not known, but she went on without waiting for an answer. It was a fascinating read. The subject was a mystical realm beyond our own, thought to be the home of many strange creatures, some of whom might even come to us in our dreams, when called upon, and share their knowledge with their summoner, for a certain price, of course. A few words had been scribbled more recently in the margin there, penned in modern English. It spoke to a certain passage in the book, referring to it as the opening of the gate. Turning to the page in question, I found what you might call a prayer or incantation. Her gaze held my eyes as her voice rose and fell in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. It was written in an ancient dialect, and barely comprehensible. I had to read it aloud, sounding out the letters bit by bit. "Do you know what it said, Michael?" She leaned forwards, her voice softening to the edge of hearing. I leaned forward to meet her, caught in some trance I didn't understand. I hardly dared to breathe. "It said," she whispered, then paused, eyes wide, mouth poised to deliver some revelation I was no longer sure I wanted to hear. Then, suddenly, she threw back her head and howled with laughter. I was so startled I almost tipped my chair over in my haste to scramble away from her. "Fuck's sake, Mikey," she was wiping her eyes. "Too easy. I was only winding you up." Still shaking with mirth, she got up from the table. "That's enough for tonight, I think. You're too old for ghost stories anyway." She began to leave, heading back to her own room. "Not gonna have your tea?" I asked. She turned, looking appraisingly at the kettle which had ceased boiling and shut itself off some time ago. Her gaze flitted to me for a second, then back again. "Oh, water's probably cold by now anyway. Night-night." Back in my bed, I kept tossing and turning over what had happened. The conversation with Jess had been uncomfortable. It was also so different from how she had acted only a few hours earlier in the day. I assumed she'd grown progressively more nervous the closer she came to going to sleep, and this was how the strain manifested. Still, if it was affecting her to such a degree, that was cause for some concern. Additionally, since she went to bed so late, I'd miss my chance to observe her actions while sleepwalking. I resolved I would speak to her tomorrow, and then try again the next night. Eventually, I drifted into a fitful sleep. It was plagued by dreams of a dark shape gliding silently around the flat, pausing outside my room for long moments before moving on to the kitchen where it ran its hand across the counters. Reaching the kettle, it caressed it almost lovingly, then spun away to dance a slow and shimmying dance across the floor. The next morning, I lay in bed for a long while before getting up. I was tired and very reluctant to rise, yet frustratingly unable to fall back asleep. Finally, I could stand it no longer, and sighing, went to perform my morning toilet. There was no sign of Jess. Possibly she was still in bed. If I was worn out, I reasoned, no doubt she would be exhausted. I ate a quick breakfast, then went out to run some errands around town. On the way back, I walked past the town library. It was not the one Jess worked at that was in the city proper, but I still toyed with the idea of going in and perhaps asking if they'd heard of the book she'd mentioned. I certainly believed she'd told the story in order to pull my leg, but still, might there not be such a book? Even so, it did seem like a lot for her to have made it all up on the spur of the moment. I dithered for a time, unable to make up my mind. I began worrying it might seem odd if I went in there and began asking about some work of mysticism or the occult, and one that might not even exist, at that. And I was still feeling tired and wanting to get back home and speak to Jess, so in the end, I decided against it. Back at the flat, I came in just as she was going out. I'd given her the spare key so she would have the freedom to go as she pleased. "Hi," she said. She looked even paler than the previous day. "Need some air, I think. Take a walk." "Sounds like a good idea," I said. She hesitated for a bit, then said, "I hope things weren't too odd last night." Oh, of course, it had been odd, and part of me wanted us to have a proper conversation about it. But then, I didn't want to add on to her worries. Better to let it go, I thought. No, it was fine. "See you later? We might order in perhaps." "Lovely," she smiled. Her hand reached out briefly to touch my arm. "You're such a lamb. You know that?" Then she was gone, and I was alone in the flat. I'd intended to watch some telly and wait for her, but once I sat down in the sofa, exhaustion washed over me like a wave. My head really felt like it was stuffed with wool. A quick nap now seemed like a necessity, and I lay back to get at least a few minutes of rest before Jess returned. When I woke, it took me a while to realize just where I was. It had gotten dark outside, and I was lying in the half-dim gloom of my living room, lit only by the light coming in from the hallway. I cast a glance at my wristwatch, which told me my catnap had lasted for more than 6 hours. I moaned. This would not help the already jumbled rhythm of my sleep schedule. Was Jess not home yet? If she had come in, why hadn't she woken me? I swung my legs of the sofa, then nearly had a heart attack as a shadow suddenly moved on the wall. I turned my head to see Jess standing silhouetted in the doorway behind me. "Terribly sorry," she said. "Didn't mean to frighten you." She came slowly into the room, a lilting quality to her stride. She must have been getting ready for bed, for she was dressed in the same t-shirt she'd been wearing the other night, though she'd forgone the fuzzy socks this time. I realized I'd forgotten to adjust the thermostat, and even being fully clothed, I thought the room felt rather chilly. Jess, however, did not seem to mind. "Scoot over," she said, and sat herself down beside me, so close my hand brushed against her bare thigh. I pulled it away immediately, but had time to register how cold her skin was. "Jess," I said, "you're freezing." She murmured dreamily, "But you're nice and warm." She leaned into me, and we sat there in silence for a moment. I felt uncomfortable. She was half naked, and once more acting so unlike her usual self. I didn't know what to do. "Why didn't you wake me?" I eventually asked. "I thought we were going to get something to eat." "Oh, I had a little something in town," she said, "and you looked so darling there on the sofa. I didn't have the heart to disturb you." Her hand had begun tracing little patterns on my chest. This couldn't go on. I made as if to get up. "Oh, don't go," she said, using the tones of a pleading child. "Stay." I managed to free myself from her embrace and went towards the kitchen. I think I'll put a pizza in the oven. Want some?" "You might say that," she purred. Her gaze caught my eyes, held them. "Michael, come here. I know you want to." "What are you talking about?" "Don't pretend. You were so eager on the phone." "Little Jess, coming to stay? So go on, fuck me." I spluttered, talking half a step backwards. "No? What? You know I don't." "Christ, Jess, you're like my baby sister. Why are you acting like this?" "I know things are." Then I stopped. I looked at her. She'd crawled forward on the sofa and lay with her hands beneath her head on the armrest, peering at me with a lazy smile, half mocking. "Jess," I said slowly, "are you asleep right now?" "Me? You are, aren't you? This is it, the sleepwalking." "I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about." She slowly got up and stretched herself, cat-like, yawning in a theatrical fashion. She said, giving the word great emphasis, am wide awake. Then she shrugged. But if you're not going to be any fun, I suppose I'll just go back to my room. Stunned at what had happened, I went into the kitchen and sat down at the table. This was bad. Now that I realized she was sleepwalking, the changes in her behavior might be comprehensible. Yet, this did little to improve the situation. Things had escalated immensely from how she'd described them before. She'd seemed perfectly lucid now, yet clearly wasn't, and there was no telling what kind of trouble she could get herself into. What if she decided on going outside? God knew what she might wake up to if she began wandering the town in her state. I had to do something, but I didn't know where to begin. I glanced at my phone, which I had put on the table. It was rather late, but maybe I could still call Mila. These were extraordinary circumstances, and perhaps she wouldn't mind too much if I woke her. Hopefully, she'd be able to tell me something useful. I didn't have her number, but a quick Googling of Jess's address listed the name and number of both residents. I glanced surreptitiously over my shoulder. No sign of Jess. Apparently she had indeed gone back to her room. I typed in Mila's number. The phone rang for a long while before she picked up. Hello. She sounded groggy, and I felt guilty for having jerked her out of what must have been a very deep sleep. Hi, Mila, it's Michael, Jess's friend. We met once, long time ago. Michael? Oh, right, Michael, hi. Her voice was more than just groggy. I realized it was mushy, like she was speaking around a mouthful of damp cloth. Sorry for the late call. So Kate, what's up? I wanted to talk about Jess actually. Mila then called Jess several very rude words. The vehemence in her voice shocked me. I knew they had parted on uncomfortable terms, but this was far more than I'd been expecting. Right, I said. She told me about the sleepwalking and having to move out and all. Oh fucking did she? Mila was rapidly becoming furious, or at least as far as I could tell with how strange her voice sounded. That's her game, is it? Getting her version of the story out? Something seemed to occur to her. You haven't seen her, have you? You don't know where she is. I hesitated. I'd assumed Jess would have told her where she was staying. Whatever had happened between them had obviously been more serious than I'd realized, but I still felt an instinct to protect Jess, at least until I had a clearer picture of things. No, I said, she just called me. Wanted to talk, right? Well, you stay far away from her. That's all. She's crazy, and she's dangerous. The police will deal with her. Steady on, I said. I know about how she called you bitch and that. But Mila gave a snort of laughter that devolved into a pained gurgle. Michael, I'm in the fucking hospital. She threw boiling water in my face. I was speechless. Mila was not. She went on to lay the entire story out. Everything Jess had said was true. As far as it went, she had been caught standing over Mila's bed and ended up having to leave, but she'd come back the next night. Of course, Mila had collected her key and gotten the spare one out from under the mat. In addition to her own, these were supposed to be it. The idea of changing the locks hadn't seemed necessary. Like you said, Mila went on. All she'd really done that far was act weird and call me names. I didn't think, and I don't know when she had a copy made, but she must have. She came in as I was sleeping. She swallowed, spent a while trying to clear her throat before going on. Well, I woke up as the water struck me. It didn't even hurt for a second. Then it burned so badly I almost couldn't think, could barely see either. But I managed to rush to the bathroom and get my face under the shower. Before I turned it on, I heard footsteps thundering down the stairs. Just getting out while the going was good, I suppose. You suppose? I clung onto this morsel like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. But you didn't see it was her, not certainly? She groaned, anger gone from her voice and sounding only very tired. Mikey, who else could it have been? I'll need grafts, you know, the doctors say. Very lucky I didn't go blind. Mila, I'm so sorry. My mind was reeling with what she'd just told me. I almost couldn't believe it was true. Sorry, not your fault. But listen, if she calls you again, try to get her to come out, or find out where she is. Set the cops on her. You'll do that? I didn't answer. I couldn't. A slim yet surprisingly strong arm had snaked around my throat. Another was pressing a damp rag to my face, involuntarily. I inhaled a whiff of something sickly sweet and pungent. The room began to spin around me. As my body began to go limp, I heard Jess hissing into my ear. Naughty, spoiling the game. Everything went dark. When I came to, my head hurt. That was the first thing I was aware of. Even as the fog in my mind receded, the throbbing pain of a migraine kept me from taking much stock of the situation. I could tell I was laying on my back on a soft surface, and that seemed like something that didn't require an immediate change. Better to keep laying here for a while longer, if only my head did not ache so abominably. I reached out with a hand to gently massage my brow. That is, I tried to reach out, couldn't. My hands were stuck. The first trickle of fear began running down my spine. It was all coming back to me now. The phone call, Jess, the rag. I jerked my eyes open. I was in my room. It was dark but for the small reading light by the armchair, but even that soft luminosity stabbed at my eyes like a knife. In the chair, Jess sat curled up like a cat, watching me. There you are. She rose languidly and came in hurriedly towards me. I tried to sit up, but it was no use. I was stretched out on my bed, bound hand and foot with cords of nylon rope. They cut into my wrists and ankles, adding lines of pain to my already aching body. Jess, I said with a sickening feeling of desperation, this is crazy. You're not well. You have to wake up. She sat herself down on the edge of the bed, rolling her eyes. Jess, why are you acting like this, Jess? Wake up, Jess, she said in an unflattering imitation of my voice. Broken record. You are. I tugged at my restraints. You have to let me go. Oh, do I? Her cold hand began caressing my face, causing me to bare my teeth at her as I tried to shake her off. She murmured. Want to bite? Hurt these pretty fingers? Somehow I don't think so. Leaning down, she nuzzled at my ear and whispered to me, but go on though. I'm all yours. Tear my throat out, if you like. She stretched her neck, brushing soft skin across my lips. I turned my head away. She gave a small sigh, half amused. Too much to expect, I suppose. She got up from the bed, stood looking down at me. I was hoping we could have played a little more. You should have seen yourself when I put on the cheap tart act. Pity you had to ruin it by getting Mila involved. That cow face doing all right? You know where they'll get the new skin, right? Coming off her arse. She giggled. Please just stop this. Yes. She made a little motion with her hand, as if my pleas were an insect that had been bothering her. You're very upset, poor baby. But don't worry. I know how to fix it. She smiled. Nice cup of tea. Then she turned, heading for the kitchen. The impact of her words did not strike me until a moment later, when I heard the sound of the kettle being turned on. Mila's words from earlier ran through my mind. I'll need grafts, you know. Lucky I didn't go blind. A wild and hideous terror gripped me. I struggled madly against my restraint, heedless of the pain. My wrists bled now, but still I tugged and tugged, until finally, with a heave that took the very last of my strength, the headboard gave in and broke clean off the bed. Thank Christ. Thank all the saints in heaven for cheap crap pieces of plywood garbage masquerading as affordable furniture. If I'd had 10 quid more to my name when I bought it, I might have gotten something better. Praise be to empty wallets. I surged up, hands still bound together but able to reach down and fumble with the knots on my legs. I saw Jess peer around the corner with a look of shock and fury on her face, heard her curse as she bolted. By the time I had freed myself, she was long gone. This was 6 weeks ago. I called the police, of course. They were already looking for her, but now they would be intensifying their search. It doesn't seem to have done any good. No one has seen the slightest sign of her so far. Perhaps it means she's moved on, found somewhere else to play. I'm allowed to hope, if nothing else. I've had all my locks changed regardless, and I make sure to put the chain on the door before it gets dark. I stay in at night now, mostly. Does it seem strange, being so scared of a girl you could pick up with one hand? Well, I escaped the plan she had for me with the water, but there are other things that can be done when you want to hurt people. I've gone online, reading about stabbings, acid attacks, and people being drenched with petrol. Only takes a second to light a match. There are pictures I wish I hadn't seen. Oh, and I asked at the library about the House of Shadows. One of Jess's co-workers wasn't quite certain, but she thought maybe she had seen something like that in the pile of submissions. When she went to look, she couldn't find it. Maybe Jess took it with her. Maybe it never existed. Doesn't matter, I suppose. As I said, I mostly stay in.